Many of us intuitively believe that intentions matter in assessing the morality of an action. If a person harms a child on purpose or by accident, there's a major difference between these two actions. Now, consequentialists can explain this moral discrepancy in terms of intentions being a good guide to future behavior. Intentions don't matter intrinsically, but they matter instrumentally, according to the consequentialist. They are a good indicator of what a person's future behavior will be like. This means that we should judge people with bad intentions differently from people with good intentions, because the bad intentions will predict bad behavior in the future, and vice versa for the good intentions. To fill out the example a bit more, there's a major difference between the person who intends to kill a child with his car and a person who accidentally kills a child with his car. Importantly, the consequentialist will cash out this difference purely in terms of future behavior. What this means is that if we knew that the person's bad intentions would never produce bad effects, then we should not judge them any differently from the person with good intentions. Because, again, according to consequentialism, things only matter if they affect the consequences. So if we knew that intentions in this case weren't going to make a difference, then we really couldn't draw the distinction that we intuitively want to between the person who intends to kill the child with his car and the person who does it merely accidentally. Fortunately, Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy takes a drastically different approach. Kant puts intentions at the fore. In fact, Kant believes that intentions are all that matter in assessing the morality of a person's actions. I quote at length the famous opening to his masterpiece, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. He puts it like this, quote, "Nothing in the world or out of it can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. Mental talents such as intelligence, wit, and judgment, and temperaments such as courage, resoluteness, and perseverance are doubtless in many ways good and desirable, but they can become extremely bad and harmful if the person's character isn't good, i.e., if the will that is to make use of these gifts isn't good. Similarly, with gifts of fortune, power, riches, honor, and even health, and the overall well-being and contentment with one's condition that we call happiness, create pride, often leading to arrogance, if there isn't a good will to correct their influence on the mind. Not to mention the fact that the sight of someone who shows no sign of a pure and good will and yet enjoys uninterrupted prosperity will never give pleasure to an impartial, rational observer. So it seems that without a good will, one can't even be worthy of being happy." He continues, "Even qualities that are conducive to this goodwill and can make its work easier have no intrinsic, unconditional worth. We rightly hold them in high esteem, but only because we assume them to be accompanied by a good will. So we can't take them to be absolutely or unconditionally good. Moderation in emotions and passions, self-control, and calm deliberation not only are good in many ways, but seem even to constitute part of the person's inner worth, and they were indeed unconditionally valued by the ancients. He's referring to the ancient philosophers such as Aristotle here. He continues, "Yet these things are very far from being good without qualification. Good in themselves, good in any circumstances. For without the principles of a good will, they can become extremely bad. For example, a villain's coolness makes him far more dangerous and more straightforwardly abominable to us than he otherwise would have seemed. What makes a good will good? It isn't what it brings about." Here's his rejection of consequentialism. "It isn't what it brings about, its usefulness in achieving some intended end. Rather, goodwill is good because of how it wills. That is, it is good in itself. Taken just in itself, it is to be valued incomparably more highly than anything that could be brought about by it in the satisfaction of some preference, or, if you like, in the sum total of all preferences." So, some pretty powerful thoughts from Kant. He didn't, of course, use the word intentions, and most philosophers tend to shy away from this word, but you get the idea. What matters is what we aim to bring about in the world, not what we actually do bring about. This is the antithesis of consequentialism, which says that all that matters is what is brought about. So, I hope you'll believe me when I say that my intention today is a good one. I intend wholeheartedly to educate you in the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Welcome to Philosophy Jam. Kant's philosophy is extraordinarily rich and complex, and many scholars disagree to this day about what he really stood for, at least about the details of what he really stood for. But hopefully what I say here will be clear and uncontroversial. I want to give you an understanding of the major elements that are at the core of Kant's ethics. Kant's philosophy, we should first say, captures many common sense intuitions about morality, unlike utilitarianism. In fact, there are many Hollywood films that capitalize on these intuitions, making the good guy a Kantian and the bad guy a utilitarian. The bad guy wants to do something horrible for the greater good, and the good guy tries to stop him. Here's a scene from the movie Swordfish that captures the dichotomy.
How can you justify all this?
Not looking at the big picture, Stan. Here's a scenario. You have the power to cure all the world's diseases, but the price for this is that you must kill a single innocent child. Could you kill that child, Stanley?
Nope.
You disappoint me. It's the greatest good.
Well, how about 10 innocents?
Now you're getting it. How about 100? How about 1,000? Not to save the world, but to preserve our way of life.
No man has the right to make that decision. You're no different from any other terrorist.
You're wrong, Stanley. Thousands die every day for no reason at all. Where's your bleeding heart for them? You give your $20 to Greenpeace every year thinking you're changing the world?
And here's a scene from The Dark Knight, where the Joker recognizes Batman's Kantian sympathies. Batman won't kill the Joker, even though refraining from killing him will probably lead to more death and destruction in the future, since we all know that the Joker will escape and keep pursuing his criminal activities.
It's a funny world we live in. Speaking of which, you know how I got these scars?
No, but I know how you got these.
You just couldn't let me go, could you? This is what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. You truly are incorruptible, aren't you? Huh? You won't kill me out of some misplaced sense of self-righteousness. And I won't kill you because you're just too much fun. I think you and I are destined to do this forever.
Since many of us have Kantian intuitions by default, movie directors can take advantage of this, coaxing us to admire the protagonists and hate the antagonists all the more. So, with this in mind, let's begin trying to understand the philosophical framework that Kant built in order to justify these intuitions. Kant thought that the ultimate source of morality had to be rooted in reason, not emotions, like happiness. The root of morality could not be anything distinctively human, since Kant thought that the laws of morality were universal and that other intelligent beings would be bound by them too. That seems to make a lot of sense, because doesn't this kind of behavior, for instance, seem morally criticizable, morally wrong, blameworthy? Check it out.
I know there is much we can learn from each other if we can negotiate a truce. We can find a way to coexist. Can there be a peace between us?
Peace. No peace.
What is it you want us to do?
What, therefore, could morality be rooted in? Well, let's think about it. What are universal laws that apply to all intelligent beings? What kinds of laws are always applicable to beings with reason? That is, what can rational beings always be evaluated by? Pause the video and try to answer these questions. They're abstract and difficult, but important, so spend some time thinking about them. Kant recognized that rational beings could always be evaluated by two kinds of laws, and I'll bet you've heard of the first. These are the laws of logic. We can always critique the reasoning of rational beings based on whether the reasoning conforms to logical principles. No table can also be not a table. No square can be round. It cannot both be raining and not raining at the same time. Any rational being that failed to recognize these truths would be irrational. Kant called this kind of reason theoretical reason. Theoretical reason, he thought, was the kind of reason that told us how things are, how the world is, and what to believe is true. He noticed that there are universal rules that govern or underlie what is true, like the laws of logic. For example, if all A's are B's and X is an A, then X is a B. Boom. And that law holds for literally everything in this universe and in any possible universe. No matter what X is, as long as it's an A, and as long as all A's are B's, X is a B. Logical necessity is a wonderful thing. And it's amazing that our minds can grasp universal laws like this, laws that literally apply to everything, and even everything that's possible. Notice that in order to be reasonable or rational in our beliefs about how things are, we must conform to these laws. I can't believe that X might not be a B in the above argument if I assume the premises are true. Or I suppose I could believe this, but doing so would be irrational. I would be violating the laws of reason. Now, Kant famously thought that there was another kind of reason too, one that was similarly applicable to all rational beings. This is the kind of reason that tells us not what is and what to believe, but instead it tells us what to do. Similar to the laws of logic in the theoretical realm, Kant thought that there were laws on rational or reasonable action. Kant divided these laws into two types. He called them hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives were laws of action, or I should say are laws of action, that require me to do things conditional on my desires. What this means is that if I want something, then I would have to take the necessary means of obtaining it. For instance, if I want to go to Milwaukee, I have to take up some means of getting there. I can't just sit back in my office and hope that I'll be in Milwaukee when I exit. That would be irrational. I have to take a car or a plane or a bus or a very, very long hike. It is in this way that hypothetical imperatives set rational constraints on action. They are rules that govern the rationality of action. But importantly, Kant believed that these were not the only kind of rules that governed action. Morality could not be found in merely hypothetical imperatives, because morality, it was thought, governed our conduct independently of our desires. I shouldn't murder merely because I don't want to. It would be wrong for me to murder even if I did want to. So the prohibition against murder applies to me independently of my desires. I just shouldn't murder. Full stop. Kant therefore thought that the rules that governed action couldn't be exhausted by hypothetical imperatives alone. The rules that governed action that applied to me independently of my desires were categorical, Kant thought. And it is in these rules, the categorical imperatives, wherein morality finds its source, its foundation. One way of thinking about categorical imperatives that came into fashion much later in philosophy is by way of the distinction between internal reasons and external reasons. Some philosophers believe that there are only internal reasons, that is, reasons that arise because of an agent's goals or desires. If I internally, meaning internal to my mind, want a pizza, then I better take the necessary steps to make one or to buy one. But if reasons are exhausted by the internal kind, the ones that are relative to my goals and desires, then there's no room for genuine morality. Because moral reasons, in order to be moral reasons at all, must apply to us independently of what we want. They therefore must be external reasons. I may have strong internal reason to murder my little cousin because that way I'll inherit a massive fortune. But I believe that I also have overriding external reason not to do this. Murdering my little cousin would end his life. It would cause lots of suffering and put an end to his conscious existence, depriving him of all the fruits of living and being a part of this world. Those seem like very real and very strong reasons for me not to drown him in the bathtub, as in Rachel's famous example. Those are very strong reasons for me not to murder him in any way. So I ought not to murder him. This is a kind of categorical imperative. It applies to me independently of my desires and goals. It's a rule that ought to govern my conduct regardless of what I want. And I would be irrational, according to Kant, not to follow it. I would be ignoring the external reason out there that weighs against my doing it. Now, what's the role of intentions in all this? Kant recognized that we were rational and autonomous beings, meaning that we could direct our lives based on certain reasons and goals. He thought that these features of rationality and autonomy were the most special features of humanity. Think back to the beginning. The goodwill controlled by reason and autonomy is the only thing in the universe that is unconditionally good. So, Kant developed a framework for sorting out the things at which it was morally appropriate or good to direct the will, from the things at which it was morally inappropriate or bad to direct the will. He thought that this sorting could be discerned through pure reason. It was the process of uncovering categorical imperatives, the imperatives that governed rational action. Kant actually thought that all of this guidance could be boiled down into one categorical imperative, the ultimate moral law. But he offered 3 different formulations of the categorical imperative. And it is nearly universally thought among scholars that these 3 formulations are actually distinct from one another. So even though Kant seems to have been wrong about there being one supreme moral principle, he offered 3 very interesting guides for uncovering what he thought were the only rationally and morally acceptable ways of directing the will, of directing our lives and actions. In this lecture, we're going to look at his first 2 formulations of the categorical imperative. Each of them captures something deeply important at the core of common sense morality. Once again, these formulations were meant to be a kind of sorting mechanism, or a kind of test. They were intended to separate the good aims of the will, the ones that were morally obligatory, or the ones that were at least morally permissible, from the bad aims of the will, the ones that were morally impermissible. The first formula or test of the categorical imperative, it goes something like this. It's called the formula of universal law. It says, act only in such a way that the maxim, that is the principle or policy implicit in your action, is fit to be a universal law. Kant thought that a maxim would be fit to be a universal law only if it were universalizable. That is, if everyone could adopt it without the maxim self-destructing, so to speak, or in other words, making the action ineffective at achieving its own purpose. So there's a lot to unpack here. First, what is a maxim? This was Kant's fancy word for describing the principle or the policy that underlies an action. We are rational, autonomous creatures. And so whenever we act, we are implicitly aiming at something. We're acting for a reason, even if that reason isn't brought to mind consciously. My snoring is not an action, so there's no reason that underlies it or motivates it. But my calling up a friend on the telephone is an action, and so there's a motive or a reason why I'm doing that. I could be calling my friend to have a nice chat with him about politics, or I could be calling him in order to lure him out of his house so my accomplice can rob it. The former would obviously be permissible, and the latter wouldn't. Kant recognized that even if the outcome of my two calls were exactly the same, that is, if I had a chat with my friend about politics in both calls, but let's say in the second one my accomplice failed to rob the house because it was locked, I would be doing wrong in one and not the other. Once again, even if they had the same results. What matters, you see, is that the motive of one action, the one of distracting my friend, is wrong, not what results from it. Kant thought that the first formula of the categorical imperative, the formula of universal law, was a way of determining whether my motive was morally acceptable. If my motive could be universalized, that is, if everyone could have it and still accomplish the goal of the action, then it would be moral. So in testing the policy behind your actions, ask, could I accomplish my goal in a world in which everyone was allowed to do this? Let's take a few examples. The first comes from Kant. This is his famous example of making a lying promise. In this example, I tell my friend that I will pay him back with no actual intention of doing so. So I borrow money from him, say I'll pay it back, but in reality, I have no plans to do that. Now, let's apply the test. Think. In a world in which everyone is allowed to do this, that is, make a lying promise in which they know they will not be able to repay the money, what would happen? Think about it. If everyone was allowed to do this, would you trust someone who came to you asking for money, promising you that he'd repay it? No. Or at least you shouldn't. The very institution of promising would break down in such a society. If everyone were allowed to break their promises, then promises would become meaningless. Promises depend, for their very existence, on the assumption that people will keep them, or at least on the assumption that people are disallowed from breaking them. So I think Kant's test shows nicely here how the action that I would be aiming at in making a lying promise would be unachievable in a world in which that maxim is universalized. Consider another example. You want to steal a piece of your neighbor's property, let's say her car, because you simply want the car. Would you be able to accomplish this action in a world in which everyone was allowed to do this? No. In fact, it seems that the very institution of property ownership would break down in such a society. We would no longer meaningfully be said to own things, since everyone would be allowed to steal them whenever they wanted. Where's the ownership in that? So if you stole the car, anybody else would be allowed to just take it right from you. In these kinds of examples, Kant's test delivers the right result. The aims of the obviously immoral actions are unachievable in a hypothetical world in which everyone was allowed to act on them. But unfortunately, not every immoral action is correctly identified by Kant's test. Consider this example. It's a very famous one in moral philosophy, first articulated by Peter Singer. And it often comes up in the context of thinking about what we owe in developed countries to the global poor. You are walking to work when you spot a child in a nearby pond drowning. It would be very easy for you to save the child. In this case, however, you choose not to, because you want to be sure that you'll have time to get your morning latte before work. So you briskly walk by the child, allowing him to drown. Think, would the aim of this action still be achievable in a world in which everyone was allowed to act on it? Well, yes, I think. Everyone would still be able to get their morning latte, even if they refused to save a drowning child in the process. But this is obviously immoral, so Kant's test does not seem to work. There are other examples of immoral actions that fail to be identified as immoral on Kant's test. I encourage you to think of some of your own examples. Nevertheless, despite these failures, there is something intuitive and right about the first formulation of the categorical imperative. It captures the intuitive idea that moral motives are ones that are justifiable to the rest of the world. They're the ones that everyone could act on. There's a deep kind of consistency and fairness in this thought. So even if Kant's test fails, even if he didn't set things up quite rightly in the first formulation of the categorical imperative, it does seem to capture something at the core of morality, especially when it comes to the values of consistency and fairness. Now, let's discuss the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which in my view is much more successful than the first. This is, again, what Kant thought to be the supreme and universal moral law, which contained all of morality. Kant called this formulation, though, the formula of humanity, or the formula of the end in itself. And it had two parts. The first says that we should never treat others as mere means. We should never use others as mere means or as tools for our own ends. I'll explain more about what that means in a second. And the second part of this formula went something like this. It said, always treat others as if they were independently and intrinsically valuable, as if they were ends in themselves. Now, Kant put it this way. He said, we should never act in such a way that we treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, as a means only, but always as an end in itself. For Kant, the word humanity was a synonym for our rational and autonomous nature. That, again, is what made us so immeasurably special, according to him. And that's why Kant thought that we should be treated so well. It's why he thought we were morally important, subjects of moral concern. Using another person as a mere means would be disrespecting their rational and autonomous nature, since you would literally be bypassing their rationality. There's something really powerful about this thought. Take an example. If I make the lying promise to you, I'm using you for an end that you don't agree to. I lie to you, getting you to think that I'll pay you back. So when you agree to give me the money, your consent is not genuine. You are in fact consenting to something that I don't end up doing. You consent to lending the money as opposed to giving the money away for good. This is a clear example of using someone as a mere means because I'm taking advantage of you in order to achieve an end, a goal that is outside of your ends, your goals. You don't agree to the end that I'm actually aiming at, namely obtaining the money with no intention of repaying you. If, however, you were to consent to my real plan, that is, if you were to consent to just giving me the money, then I'm no longer disrespecting your rationality and autonomy. I'm treating you as an end. Through consent, you come to adopt my end as your own. So I may be using you as a means to my end, but I'm not using you as a mere means. And it's strictly the latter that is morally problematic. This kind of reasoning applies to everyone you use when you engage in business transactions or other acts of reciprocity. Those people, presumably, consent to being used for pizza delivery or for table service or for lawn care, for examples. And so you're not using them in a morally problematic way. If they don't consent, however, then you are using them as mere means, which would be obviously immoral. Forced slave labor is the paradigm example here. Kant can identify with the formula of humanity what is so grossly wrong with slavery. He can explain why it is wrong in a very compelling way. You're using a slave completely against his or her consent. So even if slavery were to maximize utility, even if it were to lead to the best consequences overall, it would be wrong according to Kant. And I might recommend an article here. It's one by the philosopher R.M. Hare called "What is Wrong with Slavery?" He defends the utilitarian position here, the one that's opposed to Kant. There's also a positive component to the formula of humanity, as I mentioned. Treating someone as an end doesn't mean just leaving them alone and not interfering with them, refusing to use them as a mere means. No, to treat someone as an end, I have to respect their rationality and autonomy, sometimes by developing those traits and putting forth effort to do so. This is especially clear in the case of children. Children need an education to develop their rationality. If I refused to provide my children with this, I would be disrespecting their rationality and failing to treat them as ends in themselves. So the formula of humanity seems to be more successful than the formula of universal law. Because if we go back to the drowning child example, I would be failing to treat that child as an end in himself. I'm just briskly walking by, trying to get my latte before work. And this would be a failure to recognize the moral importance, the intrinsic worth of the child who's drowning. I wouldn't be treating him as an end in himself. Consider another example. Steve works as a boss for a waste dumping service. He doesn't feel like dumping the waste in a safe area, since that would require driving much further away. So he decides instead to dump the waste next to a local orphanage. The children get very sick because of the proximity of the waste. It gets into their water supply. Some of them die. Steve says that he didn't use the children as mere means because if they weren't there, then all the better. He didn't need the children to be there for him to successfully dump the waste. While it may be true that Steve did not use the children as mere means, he clearly failed to treat them as ends in themselves. He failed to respect their inherent value. He exhibited callous indifference to them. This is another way of failing to conform one's behavior to the formula of humanity and acting immorally. So as I said, there's the negative component of never using people as mere means, but there's also this positive component of promoting their rationality and development, and at the very least respecting them as ends in themselves with intrinsic or inherent value. Now, let's get to some objections to Kant's thinking and theories. The most obvious one is that it's not clear what it always means to treat someone as an end. For instance, I might lie to my friend because I know he would be devastated to hear the truth. Let's say his ex has just gotten into a new relationship. News of this would send my friend into a deep depression. That's why I keep it from him, even when he asks me about it. Is that wrong? On one level, it is, because I'm not respecting his rationality and autonomy. He asked me a question to which I know the answer, and so I ought to deliver the truth. Even if he would be devastated, remember, the consequences should not matter, according to Kant, I should tell him. But then again, I know that this piece of information is wholly irrelevant to my friend's life right now. He's obsessing over his ex irrationally. He shouldn't be seeking out this information at all. It will not serve him in any important way. Let's say that he'd never find out about this in any other way besides. His ex moved across the country, and there's no way he'll run into her. Most importantly, learning this new fact, I know, will deeply hurt my friend. In some sense, I'd be callous to tell him, especially if he doesn't ask for it. I want to protect his well-being, preserve his happiness and health, give him the opportunity to continue to do well in school, and not be distracted by this. Those things sound a lot like treating him as an end, or at least promoting his development and his rationality. So Kant's principle in many, many cases is problematically vague. It's just not clear what it is to respect someone as an end in himself or herself. Next, clearly, or at least I'd say it's clear, that Kant was wrong that consequences never matter. If we had to use one person as a mere means to save the entire human race from death and destruction, then I'd say we should do it. Motives can't be the only morally relevant consideration. They seem to matter, as Kant powerfully points out, but they're not all that matter. If we're going to have a reasonable Kantian view, it must be a kind of threshold view, where some profound amount of intrinsic good or the avoidance of some profound amount of intrinsic bad would justify the violation of Kant's categorical imperative. If we were to save thousands of lives, surely using one person as a mere means would be morally justified, right? Next, it seems difficult to me to build a metaethical foundation for Kant's views. It's easy to see how pleasure and pain could be intrinsically valuable and disvaluable, respectively. Suffering is horrible and should be morally prevented. Happiness is good and should be pursued. And these are objective facts, at least I'd say they are. So consequentialism or utilitarianism seem to have firm foundations in these kinds of considerations. But why does Kant put such a premium on rationality and autonomy and the goodwill? Why are these traits in particular so special? Why does having these traits make us the ultimate subjects of moral concern? It's not a logical connection between rationality, autonomy, and morality, on the other hand. There are lots of other very special traits about humans. For instance, we fall in love. We can appreciate and create beautiful art. We can solve complex equations that describe the fundamental nature of the universe. These things are also very amazing. Why should we be so impressed with rationality and autonomy in particular, and think that those are the traits that give us our moral status, as opposed to others? I don't think Kant had a good answer to this. And this line of objection brings us to a last really, really important and I think fatal objection to Kant's theories, or at least fatal to them in the current form, the original form, I should say. Kant's theory seems to imply that beings without rationality and autonomy are mere things, undeserving of moral concern. Surely this is true of things like rocks and tables. They have no worthiness of intrinsic moral consideration. But what about animals? What about young infants who have no rationality? What about the elderly who are afflicted with severe Alzheimer's disease? Certainly, all of those kinds of beings seem worthy of moral consideration. But we shouldn't give it to them according to Kant's views. He thought that it would be wrong to torture animals because that would make us coarser and more callous, likely to behave towards other humans in bad ways. But these are purely instrumental reasons for avoiding harming animals. They have nothing to do with the well-being of the animals themselves. Animals have no intrinsic moral value, according to Kant. He seems wrong here for two reasons. One, it's not clear that we would in fact become bad people by torturing animals. This is a highly questionable empirical assumption on Kant's part. I've known many butchers who are very nice to other people, but very cruel to animals. Second, and more importantly, animals seem to matter in their own right. As Bentham said, the question is not can they talk or can they reason. The question is, can they suffer? 1 second. Animals definitely can suffer. They're sentient creatures, and that's why I think it's wrong to torture them. The same could be said about babies and the senile. They have intrinsic worth despite lacking rationality and autonomy. I think it's clear that my cat here has a kind of intrinsic moral worth. I would be wronging him if I harmed him, and I would be doing something morally obligatory by taking care of him and ensuring that he was healthy and happy. Perhaps there's a way of saving Kant's theory from these problems. The theory is very promising on its face, and maybe it can be modified to meet the objections that I've addressed here. I encourage you to attempt to find a way to do that. But for now, I'll close. Please take a look at the discussion questions, and thanks for joining me this week on Philosophy Jam.
From this reality, you've got to be saved. Picture the crest of an arcing wave, right through the curl of a simpler time. Open your heart to the tides and their signs. This is a song about surfing the swells. They're calling me loud like resounding bells. Lexi the surfer, ripping up those turns. Oh Lord Poseidon, how my heart burns. My heart it burns for the arcing waves. 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 Thy arch, love to us all and the universe at large. Love to us all and the universe at large. Love to us all and the universe at large. Love to us all.